Okay, welcome everybody. Let's get started. When I look at sort of the main areas that we work on at the bank, I would say at least 3 of them include inequality, conflict, and education. Now, what we have here today is a speaker, Eliana LaFerrara, who has actually worked on all 3 areas. So it's very hard, it's rare to find that unique individual who covers those 3 priority areas. And I'm delighted to introduce her as our deck lecture speaker. And she will talk about the education part, aspirations, stereotypes, and educational choices. Eliana, welcome.
So thank you, Shanta, and all of you for coming and for inviting me. It's an incredible honor to be here in front of this distinguished crowd that knows a lot about not only what I'm going to talk about, but the other topics that Shanta mentioned. And this particular talk will be about some work that I've been involved in recently that combines behavioral and education economics. It's not new to us, the notion that there's poverty traps, and the traditional theories emphasize constraints that are external in the sense of coming from either limited access to credit and insurance markets, malnutrition. But what the recent interaction with behavioral economists have generated is a very interesting set of hypotheses where these poverty traps might not only be triggered by resource constraints, but also by constraints internal to the individual. So in particular, there could be a cycle going from poverty to the fact that an individual doesn't perceive certain goals as attainable, so has low aspirations. Then the choice of making low or suboptimal investment because such goals are unattainable, and the fact that these low investment perpetuate a state of poverty. So this kind of aspiration trap is newer compared to the standard poverty trap, and has the implication that it won't be enough to endow people with resources, because unless you change their mindset, they might not get out of poverty. Now, this type of mechanism, you may imagine, is particularly relevant if you consider groups that are negatively stereotyped. Why? Because these groups are more likely to hold a low self-image and hence believe that certain goals are unattainable. And there has been what's the so-called stereotype threat hypothesis, documenting that very often marginalized groups internalize these negative stereotypes and therefore underperform. So what I thought I could do in the lecture is to focus on a context where both stereotypes and aspirations play, in my view, a crucial role, which is education and educational choices. This is a setting where whatever underinvestment you make will have long-term consequences, because it's going to determine your job prospects. And I'll give you a flavor of the type of work I've done by covering 2 quite different settings. One is Italy, where I've done some projects with immigrant children in middle schools. And the other is South Africa, where I've studied instead stereotypes not towards immigrants, but towards the Black South African population. In all of these projects, there's an attempt to combine original data collection and experimental data with administrative sources. And then, as you will see, the focus shifts from interaction with more hierarchically superior individuals like teachers, in the case of students, to interaction with peers. I'll try to, walk through a path where we start by understanding how students or young people make choices, when their aspirations and perceived barriers might be affected by the fact that they're marginalized, and I look at immigrant children in Italy, and then move to the role played by others' opinions on what my chances are going to be. So in one case, it will be the teacher's opinions. In the other case, it will be the other students' opinions. And in both cases, I'll try to document to what extent these opinions play a role in, making you underperform, but also give a hopefully, bit more positive message in thinking of policies that might allow us to counteract these negative stereotypes. So in the case of teachers, I will tell you about an experiment we've done in revealing teachers their own stereotypes and to see how they reacted to that. And in the case of students and peers, I'll tell you about our assessment of policy that creates contact across groups in South Africa. And so in both cases, the idea will be, okay, there are these potentially negative consequences, but we shouldn't take them as something that policy cannot change. So this means that I'll try to use the hour that I have to go through 3 papers. I don't know if I'm going to be successful, but I'll do my best. And the first is this work that I've done with Michela Carlana, now at the Kennedy School, and Paolo Pinotti from Bocconi, which we called Goals and Gaps, for reasons that are going to be quite clear soon. So first of all, if you take a bunch of OECD countries and you look at the share of people in their 20s who have low educational attainment, there is a very systematic pattern where natives are much less likely to have low attainment compared to immigrants. Immigrants are the red bars in these graphs, and this holds both for men and for women. And this lower attainment is supposedly one of the factors for their reduced access to labor market opportunities. Now, Italy and these, in general, many of these OECD countries are an interesting setting where choices about your track are made early on. So the systems that have early tracking are systems where high school is already differentiated for students. It's not like in the US. And this is important because if you fail to make the right choice when transitioning from middle school to high school, you might eventually not have access to a college education or to high-paying jobs. And some work has shown that at that age, when the early transition is supposedly happening, disadvantaged groups like immigrants often have information gaps, so they are less aware about the opportunities that they could have. And also, thanks to this recent research I mentioned, they might be more likely to have aspirations track. So what we wanted to do in our work was, first of all, understand if it's true that these children under-aspire when choosing school. Because clearly, the immediate answer is that if you observe a choice, it's going to be very hard to think how many constraints that person had that generated the choice. So just the fact that we don't see them going to very good or high, demanding academic tracks, does it mean that it's the suboptimal choice or not? So we'll try to tackle these questions, but then also we'll try to say if the failure to apply for what you could potentially achieve comes from some mental barrier, can you help people realize their potential? And so I'm going to tell you about a tutoring intervention, which was really trying to tackle this behavioral component and not just the information or the academic one. Okay? So this will be a large-scale program that we'll implemented with the Ministry of Education. And so for us, it's something that could potentially speak to policy options. So in order for you to understand what we did, I need to give you a background on one slide, background on the Italian schooling system. In Italy, stratification occurs after grade 8. Okay, so up until middle school, everybody's in the same system, and then in grade 8, you enroll into one of 3 tracks. The most prestigious, which is called Liceo, is the academic-oriented track, and that typically is taken by people who will continue with college. Then there's a still high quality, but slightly more applied track. That's the technical institutes. And after finishing one of these, you could either enroll in college or get a job directly. And then there's a track which is vocational education, which differently from the German system, for example, in Italy carries quite a low status. So this is both in terms of not directly giving you access to college, and because if you take surveys and polls of recent graduates, the level of satisfaction, their grades, their wages, their access to jobs is no better than those with technical education. So what we're going to really look at here is whether the choice of enrolling in a vocational school is something that we should take for granted from some of these groups, or if we can push them to one of the higher track when they have academic potential.
Get to the technical, to the college.
Yes, yeah, directly. You don't need to take. Yeah, so there will be some college degree programs where you need to take an entry test, but that's the same for everybody. While for the vocational, it used to be the case that you really couldn't access it. Now you can, but you have to have one makeup year or take some extra exams. So it's not direct access because the curriculum is really very different from the other schools. So the fact that everybody seems to believe in Italy and in many of the countries with early tracking is that when you look at native students and immigrants are more likely to choose vocational, and this is there in the data. Now, just taking this fact is hardly informative. Why? Because we don't know whether on average immigrants are as well-performing academically as native students, so we need to control for ability. And what we will do in our work is to use the fact that in the Italian system, students are tested through a blindly graded multiple choice type of test at different points in their career, and so you have these standardized test scores. I will use the Italian name, which is Invalsi test, repeatedly during the talk. So these Invalsi tests occur at different points in time, and so we will use the entry-level score as a proxy of how good the student was potentially, okay? So the evidence that I'll show you with this graph on what we call educational segregation basically holds constant the ability of the student by plotting on the horizontal axis the quintiles of these standardized test scores that the student had in 6th grade, and then asking what is the probability that a student within this quintile will enroll in a high track, which would be academic or technical, as compared to vocational. And something I didn't mention, but I should have, is that in Italy there's hardly any block. I mean, in the sense that if you want to enroll in a high school, you are free to do it. It's free public education. Only very few high schools that have massive oversubscription will have entry tests, but they're virtually absent throughout the country. So it's really demand-driven. If you want to go to a high track, you can do it. So what you see in this graph is that throughout the distribution, immigrant boys are systematically less likely to enroll in the high track compared to native Italians. And that tells you that, even when you look at the very high performing, either they are they are facing a set of constraints that are completely unobserved to us, or there is something that they are not getting in making this choice. And this is something that I'll try to dig into shortly. Now, this is the graph for boys. If you look at girls, the situation is interestingly quite different. So you still see a gap between immigrant girls and native ones in the low end of the distribution, but from the third quintile up, they basically choose exactly like Italian girls, okay? So this is something that was unknown to us, and in general, only by combining this data, the two sources that I will shortly describe could be realized. But in fact, when we designed the intervention, we decided to treat boys and girls symmetrically because we were unaware of the fact that for girls there was no choice problem to start with. And interestingly, as you will see, our intervention did not have an impact on girls because there was no failure to compensate for, okay? So if you look at this high school choice, one interesting component is that in the system, the student is free to go wherever they want, but the teachers are asked to give a recommendation about halfway through the year, early in the 8th grade, as of what they think that the student would be most suitable for, okay? And so this graph is very similar to the one you saw before. So on the horizontal axis, I'm still plotting people by quintile of their test score. But now we are measuring the probability that the teachers recommend the student for a high track, so either academic or technical. And what you see is that if teachers were purely reacting to how well the student is doing, once you are in the same bin, they should treat native and immigrants the same way, and instead they systematically recommend Italian kids for the high track with a higher probability than immigrant kids, okay? So it might be that they internalize some family constraints or not. In the second paper, I will show you that these teachers are actually massively biased in the way they see immigrant children, and so there's some feature in the system which gives teachers a say, even though not binding, which might also be necessary to address, to realign choices. So how did we go about filling this aspirations gap and seeing whether the choice of vocational was really something that kids were making in a, informed and consistent way? We designed a program in collaboration with the Ministry of Education where the target was not the general immigrant population, but the high-performing kids. So this was meant a bit as a social mobility type of intervention, where we said, okay, if you have a child who's really promising, can you help this child go to a, high-quality high school? And so we weren't sold to sending them to academic or technical, but we wanted to align the choice with their potential. So we sampled schools so that they would have a certain size of immigrant population, at least 20 students, and we worked in 5 provinces of northern Italy with a total of 145 schools. So slightly less than a half were randomized into the program, and the remaining schools stayed as a control group. And in each school, we ranked immigrant students based on their test score in grade 6. So we take the immigrant population and we ask, who are the 10 best students in this school? And to these 10 students, we offer the opportunity to enroll in a program that will run for 1.5 years during grades 7 and 8. Okay, so we advertised the program at the end of grade 6, and about 80% said that they were interested in participating in the program. So what was this program made of? It had 2 components. The first is the more psychological one, which is based on the career choice consultancy theory. We endow them with information about the Italian schooling system. This is part of what all the schools should already do, but schools vary a lot in the extent to which they provide you detailed information on subjects and work opportunities, and also the family is hardly able to follow anything of what's going on in the school. So as part of our programs, not only these students were informed one-to-one about these options, but also we created a booklet that was translated in their own language that the kids could take home. So possibly the family would also improve their knowledge about the system. Also, there were a lot of meetings that were with counselors and that were really aimed at working with the student through their own successes, failures, and plans for the future. So here you see an example of the type of activities which were done at different points during the course of the 2 years. In some cases, we used peer education or videos on, successful students who were of immigrant background but had gone on to do successfully the demanding track. So some of you will know that another big part of my agenda is about this educational entertainment and role modeling through videos. So also this one had a bit of a component of that. Then there were these exercises where the counselor would sit with the student and say, okay, think about experiences where you were successful in the past, either in study or something else. Which resources did you leverage to do that? Which one instead did you feel you were lacking? And if you now turn to the profession that you would like to have, do you feel that you have the resources that are needed, and which ones do you need to accumulate? So this, if you think about this goal-setting type of agenda, this is very helpful because sometimes people are put off by the fact that they see a goal, but they don't know how to reach there. So this creating a sequence of steps and breaking the problem down into what do I need, what should I work on right now, and what in the future is part of the potential reason for the effectiveness that we will see. And finally, yeah, we had a bunch of aspirations questions as well. Now, this was the more behavioral, psychological component of the intervention. There was another part that was more standard and more academic in nature. So these kids also got a tutor on Italian language, which meant to endow them with the ability to do well if they chose to go to a demanding high school, okay? So the idea here was to say, okay, it's true that these are the top 10 immigrant students in this middle school, but if they end up going to a demanding academic track, will they be at par in terms of knowledge of the language and how you can effectively organize your time for studying with the natives or not? And so there was this component where, depending on your initial test score, you were assigned to a different number of meetings in Italian tutoring. And as you will see, this is going to be important for us. Why? Because unfortunately, we could not have a fully a 2x2 design where we would assess separately the effectiveness of the two components. The funders were very worried about pushing students too high without giving them the tools to succeed. And so for ethics concerns, this CALP, which is the academic language proficiency, was required to be there throughout the intervention. But we will be able to exploit the cutoff threshold on the number of meetings to at least get a sense of how big a role the intensive margin played. So having more or less meetings, did it make a difference? Okay. So the projects I present that have to do with immigrant kids in Italy required a big investment on our part in getting two pieces of the system to talk to each other, because in Italy all the records that are about progression through grades as well as test scores, meaning the tests that are graded by your own teachers are held by the Ministry of Education. But then this standardized test score is implemented, graded, and the records are held by a completely different agency, indeed Invalsi, and they make it a point of everything being anonymous because of potential, complications with disclosing performance at different levels. So this means that neither the ministry nor the agency own a crossover code that would allow you to link students from one data set to the other. The only institution that holds that crossover code is the school itself. So doing the project meant triangulating with each and every school so that we could match the test scores from the blindly graded exam with all the rest of the educational choices. And it's thanks to this match that we now could control for ability and will be able to do a lot of what we do in the analysis. But what's nice is that now these two agencies have started a more regular and long-lasting collaboration. So research on Italian education will be able to use both types of data, hopefully, from now on. And then, of course, because this being about aspirations and barriers, we wanted to collect more questions on students' expectations and beliefs. We had our own survey. So I won't show you balance, but the randomization worked fine. So the first thing I want you to see is this table that reports the impact of the program on high school choice. So this is basically the most important finding of the paper. So the left-hand side variable is the probability that a student chooses the high track, so technical or academic, where the the reference category would be vocational. And then you see two columns on the full sample, two for boys and two for girls. And there are two columns because one specification doesn't control for anything and the other control for individual characteristics, including the performance of the student, so the standardized test score. Okay? So what you can see is that on average there was an impact, but the impact is entirely driven by boys. So compared to a probability of about 70% for natives, for immigrants in non-treated schools of choosing the high track, we bring up this probability by 9 or 8 percentage points, which is a 12% increase. And so this is actually not only sizable, but what's remarkable is that it completely closes the gap between immigrant boys and native boys. So if you look at the left-hand side panel of this figure, you see, no, sorry, I was trying to use a light, but I don't think it's working. Anyway, so you see three columns. The first one is the control schools. So these will be immigrant students who have not received the program. And that's their probability of enrolling in the high track. So it's around 68%. Then you see the treated students, and you see that this is substantially higher. We said it's 99 percentage points higher. And the last bar is a group of Italian students who are of comparable ability. So this means that these are the Italians who in 6th grade had the same test score. Okay? So if we had not offered the program, the boys in the red bar would have been at the same level as the blue bar. And what happened through the program is that we brought those boys to the same probability of choosing a demanding high school as the natives. If you look at the girls, it's very clear that the control, the treatment and the comparable Italian group have exactly the same probability of choosing the high track, which is, by the way, also on average higher than for the boys, but this is not very unusual, okay? So this is the kind of the success story in terms of closing the gap for the boys. If you think of grade retention, which is also a measure not only of the aspiration in terms of educational track, but of how well you've been doing in school and how smoothly you proceed through the system, you see that grade retention rates for immigrant boys are actually non-negligible. In the control group, it's 7%. Okay, either in grade 6 or 8. And what our program does is that it cuts that by half. Okay, and again, I won't show you the histogram, but again, we get to the same grade retention rate as for Italian boys. Now, what's interesting to us is to understand how this change in performance and in choices comes about. And we go through 3 separate potential mechanisms. The first is cognitive skills. So it might simply have happened that the program helped these kids do better in school, and that once you do better in school, you choose a different high school. The second is non-cognitive skills. So here we're going to see whether indeed the aspirations and all of that comes with these perceptions of the students have been affected. And finally, because I told you that teachers potentially play an important role, we're going to see how teachers react to the fact that some student is in the program or is not in the program.
So what would you put peer effects? Suppose no one tells them that this is something.
Yeah. So I would put them both in 1 and in 2, because I think the interaction between students making choices could affect both their incentive to work hard because they see peers working hard, or their expectations and perceptions. There will be, I will show you some results, or maybe I just didn't put the table, but I will tell you what we find on spillovers, and it's actually quite interesting in terms of our program actually affecting students who were not exposed to the counseling and everything else. But I think peer effects would go in both categories, both the cognitive and the non-cognitive side. So cognitive skills clearly improve, but only for boys. So this to us was another shocking result, in the sense that I told you we treated boys and girls symmetrically, and it's true that maybe girls were not under aspiring, but if you take 33 or 55 meetings of Italian language, the fact that you don't learn much from those as a girl is potentially, telling. And in fact, it turned out that we targeted, the wrong side of the distribution for the girls. But for the boys, we see an increase in their performance in these standardized test scores of about 1/5 of a standard deviation, so 0.2 or 0.16 of a standard deviation, depending on whether we're looking at math or Italian. And so this is quite a sizable effect. Now, it's important to say, this improvement in performance, so they learned something and they did better in school. Was it simply because you gave them tutors, or also because they themselves decided to make more of an effort and their aspirations changed? So, as I told you, we won't be able to give the, fully fledged and bulletproof answer that would have required a 2x2 design. But what we can do is to look at how the number of meetings was assigned and exploit that rule. So here you see a table where there are 3 cutoff points. So the first one is 65 out of 100. So if you get a score of 65 in the 6th grade entry test, that means you're not doing very, very well. So for these students, the program provided meetings on the academic tutoring, both in 7th grade and in 8th grade, for a total of 55. Okay? If you had a score between 65 and 80, then you were supposed to be doing well enough that you didn't need tutoring, academic tutoring in grade 7, but you still got 33 meetings of that in grade 8. And if you were above 80, then you were supposed to be fine. But as you see, only 4% of our students were above 80 to start with, okay? So these are the top 10 performing immigrants, but they are not at the very top of the distribution of grades. So what we're going to be able to exploit is the threshold of 65. Okay, where we have enough mass. So we'll look at immigrant students in treated schools whose entry test score was right below 65, so who got 55 meetings, and those whose score was right above and who only got 33. And if you look at that and you compare their test scores, or you could also put the probability of choosing a high track on the vertical axis. The graph looks the same. You see that there's no difference. So between those who got 33 and those who got almost twice as many meetings, performance wasn't affected and high school choice wasn't affected. Now, of course, this does not allow us to say what would have happened if we had given them 0 meetings, because we don't have that variation. But on the intensive margin, the academic side of the program didn't seem to be very influential. On the other hand, the non-cognitive skill part, as you will see, turns out to be quite important. So here, we included in our questionnaire for the students a whole set of questions related to goals, like what level of education would you like to achieve? Questions on self-efficacy, like, thinking about your ability, do you think you could get a university degree? And things on perceived barriers, like, do you think that the following could be an obstacle for you to achieve educational goals? Economic barriers, racial prejudice, ideas of your family. So we had a battery of questions for each of these categories, and then we ran a principal component analysis and aggregated them into 2 indices. The first one is going to be about academic motivation, how far you want to push yourself in terms of future educational outcomes, and the other is about perception on the barriers that your family, the system, and or economic constraints might play in your choices. So when you look at the effect of our program on motivation as well as barriers, you see that indeed it helped improve ambitions of the boys, not of the girls, while it worked on both genders when it came to making them think that their family or society as a whole shouldn't play such a role in their decision. So we see changes in these non-cognitive skills, in some cases for both boys and girls. And the last thing is just to be able to assess whether these changes, both in the aspirations of the kids and in performance, translated into teachers giving different recommendations, okay? So what we're doing in this table is we are using data on the cohorts that we study and that we treated, and look at whether for the students who were assigned to the program, teachers' recommendations are systematically more positive than for the immigrants who are in the control group. And we find that they are if we look at boys, but not if we look at girls, okay? Now, this for us is actually good news. Why? Because one concern you might have is that now these teachers know that there is this program being run in the school, and so just because they want to, be complacent, or they are framed into thinking that these immigrants should now go to a higher track, they recommend everyone more for these high tracks. What this table shows is that although the teachers know equally well that boys and girls are enrolled in the program, they only recommend the high track more for the boys. And who are the boys? The boys are precisely the ones whose academic performance had improved. We saw that for the girls there was no change, so why should I as a teacher send you to a more demanding school? So for us, this is indirect evidence that experimental demand effects are hopefully not so strong when it comes to teacher in this context, okay? So additional analysis that we did were like a variance decomposition to see which of these three components seems to play the biggest role, and they are motivations as well as teachers' recommendation. Then we looked at medium-term effects, so going beyond the choice of high school to seeing how well are they doing now that they are in high school, and this is important because you don't want to overshoot and place them in an environment where they underperform. And what's interesting is that once they are in high school, the treatment effect is a 0, which means that they're not better, but they're not worse than the control group students in terms of failure rates or make-up exams that they have to take. And this treatment effect of 0 is good news. Why? Because if you are in a more demanding school, and you're doing equally well, it means that I haven't damaged you. Okay? And finally, we looked at spillovers, and here we have quite a nice, I think, set of results. The first one is that if you look at the boys who are in class with a treated student, both natives and immigrants are less likely to be retained during grade 7 and 8. So all the boys seem to be doing a bit better when it comes to retention probability. The effect is much stronger for the immigrants. We also find improvements in this grade that we give in Italy on behavior, whether your discipline is good in the classroom. I don't know if it exists here, but so this is something that could proxy for behavioral issues with the boys, and we see that in fact immigrant boys do better on that. Interestingly, high school choice is not affected for immigrant boys, but it's affected for immigrant girls, okay? And this seems initially counterintuitive because you could say, well, if you didn't find an effect on high school choice of the treated girls, how can you expect to find spillovers if there was no direct effect? And the reason this is not as counterintuitive is that we are looking at different parts of the distribution. So the treated girls were girls in the top end, and we saw that at that level they were already choosing like Italians, while in the lower quintiles, they were under choosing. So when we look at spillovers, by definition, we're taking someone who was not in the top 10. So for the girls, these are people who at the margin might have been at the right level to be affected. But for the boys, the ones who were not selected are probably too low in the distribution to end up choosing a demanding high school. So the asymmetry in the effect of the spillovers actually bides well with the type of differences in probability that we had along the distribution. And again, teachers' recommendations don't respond to what's happening in terms of spillovers, okay? So summing up what we learned from this first project, we learned, first of all, that you can reduce educational segregation and align high school choices between immigrant and native boys. And the mechanisms seem to be really strongly driven by the students' motivation as well as the teachers' support. Now, in terms of implications, the program we ran was very intense and quite expensive as well, because there were all these one-to-one meetings, both on the counseling and on the tutoring side. But given that we found soft skills to be playing such an important role, I think ideally one could experiment with interventions that purely focus on that aspiration component and that could be cheaper and scalable to implement. So if you think, for example, the role model effect played a role, videos or other exposure to role model could be working. Also, because we found that teachers' recommendation did affect choices, this led us to think about a completely different way of tackling the problem, which is really changing the attitudes of the teachers. So what can we do about making teachers more optimistic or less biased when they think about the prospects of immigrant children? And so this is going to be the next issue that I talk to you about. So this is a project with Michela and Paolo, where also Alberto Alesina joined, where we are trying to look at the teachers that were working in the schools that we had in the project and first of all, measure their behavior in terms of grading policy, but also experiment with them a little bit in making them aware about stereotypes. So why stereotypes? Well, because stereotypes, although they are cognitively useful tools, are one of the sources of discrimination in today's society. And because we're looking at children who are making critical educational choices, being the object of negative stereotype at that point, as I already said, will have particularly detrimental effects. So we want to be able to do two things. The first is to really document whether teachers are biased or not, in the sense that right now I showed you that they are less likely to recommend students for a high track. I will also show you that they are grading these students by giving them lower grades, but I want to link this to their own subjective bias against immigrants, and that's what we'll do in the first part of the paper. The second is that we want to test a simple tool for changing these stereotypes, which is revealing people how biased they are, okay? So I'll tell you how we measure this bias. It's going to be an implicit association test. But if any of you have ever taken one, sometimes, the outcome is a bit of a negative surprise, and you find that you're that you have more stereotypes than you thought you had. So what we're going to do is simply that. We're going to have people take IATs and then randomly tell them how badly or how well they did, okay? And this will allow us both to see if they change their grading once they learn, but also to indirectly understand if they were consciously discriminating against immigrants or if they were not aware of this negative stereotype. So the sample will be schools from the same 5 provinces that we've worked for the other project. This time we recruited almost 1,400 teachers in math and what I call literature, which will be Italian, both reading and literature indeed. And these teachers have students for 3 years in a row. So in the Italian system, middle school locks you in a class with the same peers and the same teacher for grades 6 to 8, okay? So we ran a survey with the teachers where, in addition to asking for demographics, attitudes, and so on, we had them take an implicit association test. And then on the students, for this project, we didn't run any survey. We simply used administrative data on the grades that we're getting from the teachers, their own teachers, and the grades that they got in the standardized test, okay? So why is it very useful to have these two sources? Because at the end of grade 8, when you graduate from middle school, in the same week, you take 2 tests. One is graded by your teacher, and the other is graded by another teacher in the school, and the test does not have your name on it, only a code. So nobody would be able to know that you were the one who filled in that paper, okay? So if you take the same person, it's very unlikely that in the course of 1 week, their knowledge improves or deteriorates a lot. So if you systematically do better in the blindly graded than in the teacher-graded test, this is indirect evidence of potential discrimination. So that's what we'll be using on the student side. But let me just spend a couple of minutes on the IAT for those of you who are not familiar with it. So this is a tool from social psychology that looks at how fast you are in pairing concepts. And the idea is that if 2 things are commonly associated in your mind, you pair them up very quickly. The reason it's used is that instead of asking people, are you biased, which would obviously not go very well with some of us, you just see how they do in this computer game. So you have a series of screenshots like the one that you see here, where the task is hit right or left as quickly as you can, but the job is to assigning the word that pops up in the center to one of the two top corners. So in this case, you see a name who's a name of an immigrant child, potentially, and the corners have a category and an attribute. So the category would be Italian or immigrant, and the attribute is good or bad, okay? So now, because the name is immigrant, my job in this screenshot is to hit right, because immigrant pertains to that corner. But you see that by chance, now in that corner, the word good is next to immigrant. So if I'm a prejudiced person, my mind is not very familiar with the combination that associates immigrant and good. So I will still hit the right button, but I will be a little slower in doing so than a person who associates immigrants with good all the time. Okay? So what the IAT does is basically to flash a large number of these screenshots, alternating the words that you use, and so the combination on the corners as well as what comes up. And it calculates your average speed. So if I'm a slow or a fast person in playing with this, it's normalized. And then looks at whether the deviations from this average are systematically in one direction. Okay? So that outcome that it returns is a score. Here you see the distribution of this score in our sample of teachers. The two lines are the score for the math teachers, so that's the green line, and the score for the literature teachers, so they're virtually identical, so teachers are equally biased. And a score of 0 is the person who has exactly the same speed no matter what combination they see, okay? So that's the person with no bias. In this coding, the positive scores are associated with someone holding a negative opinion of immigrants, so being slower in that type of association. And the vertical lines that you see correspond to cutoff levels that psychologists have defined over the years to decide who is moderately biased and who is severely biased, okay? So we're going to be using these cutoff levels in our communications to the teachers, but for now, all you want to take out of these pictures is that basically the vast majority of the teachers in our sample are biased against immigrants. So here's a table with the correlates of IAT. Let me not go through it for the sake of time, and go to the first set of results. So first of all, are teachers biased against immigrants? So what you see here is the usual plot with the blind test score quintile on the horizontal axis. And then on the vertical axis, this time is a teacher assigned grade, which basically ranges from about 3 to 10. Okay? So if you believe that the teacher does not discriminate between Italian and immigrant students, and you believe the Invalsi standardized test score to be a good enough proxy of what the student has learned, those two lines should coincide because the teacher should give the same grade to both types of students. Instead, what do? Both math and literature teachers give systematically higher grades to Italian kids compared to immigrant ones. Okay? So the literature that's out there has already looked at this type of divergence between blindly and non-blindly graded test scores, both when it comes to racial groups and to gender, for example, and takes the gap to be evidence of discrimination. We could stop there, but we want to try and go further and say, look, maybe immigrants are for some reason better at taking multiple choice tests. So comparatively speaking, these divergences could reflect some unobservables that we don't have in the data. So let's raise the bar and ask if the gap in grade is the same across teachers, or if this gap is particularly high for those teachers that came up with a high score in the IAT, because these are the more biased teachers, okay? So what we do is we estimate a regression where the dependent variable is the grade given by the teacher. Then we have a dummy, which is 1 if the student is an immigrant. Okay? And there you see already in column 1 that on average these immigrant students get a grade that is half a point lower. In column 2, it's enough to control for the Invalsi cubic polynomial, so for what they've learned objectively, to decrease the gap to 0.10. So, you know, part of the difference is because of what they knew, but what I'm now interested in is columns 3, 4, and 5, where what we look is if the penalty in the grade for immigrant students is systematically higher from teachers who have a high IAT score, so who are biased. And that's in fact what we're finding. Okay, so there's no reason why, if there is an unobservable, which is, you know, how good you are in essays versus multiple choice questions, that gap would be bigger when you have a teacher who's biased, if not because of discrimination. Now, interestingly, this pattern is found for math teachers, but it's not found when you look at literature teachers. Okay? And at first people would say, well, but literature, if anything, seems more discretionary and math more objective. But there's different things. First of all, math grading is not as objective as you might want, because you still, you know, you have a sequence of logical steps to take, and I could decide to give you credit for that or not. If you make a calculation error, I could give you partial credit or not. Plus, what we find, we've worked a bit with the data, is that, also it's well known in the education literature that standardized test scores are a better proxy for your objective knowledge when you look at math compared to reading and other skills. But we looked at what literature teachers do in terms of potentially holding students to different standards. So one conjecture is that the math teacher says, even if you're an immigrant, you need to know math as well as Italian students need to, while the literature teacher might say, okay, I'm biased, I don't have a very high opinion of immigrants, I don't think they're ever going to get to a level of proficiency with the language where they truly deserve certain grades, so let me just pass them, okay? So what we've done is we've compared how they grade first and second generation immigrants, because the idea is that if you're a second generation immigrant in Italian, your proficiency and fluency with the language will be very, very similar to that of Italian kids. So what we find is that indeed the teachers who are biased and are teaching literature tend to be helping first generation more compared to second generation, and that would go exactly in the opposite direction that the negative bias in grading goes. So that could account for the zero impact on literature teachers. So let me now go to the experiment and to the policy implication of this. So we find that teachers are biased. What do we do about it? So our first approach was to say, let's not take it for granted that they choose to be biased. And let's tell them what we found, okay? So when they took the IAT, we had asked them, would you like to receive feedback and know how you did on the test? And about 80% of them said, yes, I want to receive feedback, okay? We tested, and this feedback is not correlated with how biased they are. It's basically that they were in a rush and they wanted to go home and not leave their email address and fill in the form. But we will estimate an intention to treat effect. So what we did to give feedback is that we prepared an email with a brief description of what the IAT was, and then we said, based on your score, you are either slightly or moderately or strongly associating immigrant names with negative concepts. So we told them the point value of their score, but because this would mean very little to them, we also had these words, okay? And to be able to estimate the impact of this communication, we randomized, so everybody got it eventually, but we randomized the timing, okay? So at the end of January, students in grade 8 are given their end of semester grades. So to half of the schools, we sent the communication with the feedback in the last 2 weeks before the grading period, and to half of the schools in the first 2 weeks after grades had already been decided. So the teachers who got the communication at the end of January, like the green star in the graph, were still in time to revise their grades and say, okay, you know, if I have to decide whether to approximate up or down, I can help you in one direction. While the teachers who got it in February, it was too late because they had already posted the grades, okay? So what happened? You can see it in this graph. So here you see the grades. I told you they go from about 3 or 4 to 10. And on the left, you have the distribution of grades to immigrant students. On the right, to native students. Now, the blue bars are from the schools where the feedback was given in time to adjust. And the white bars are for the schools where the feedback was given late. So what you see is that the distribution of grades to immigrants shifts to the right in the treated schools, and the distribution of grades to the natives shifts to the left in those treated schools. So they basically readjusted the relative grading of immigrant and native students. And this was done both by math teachers and by literature teachers, okay? This is not surprising, even though I showed you that this interaction term was not significant for literature. Remember that the intervention here is an email where we tell you you are strongly biased or, you know, moderately biased. And given the same distribution of the IAT, math and literature teachers on average got exactly the same feedback, which was equally bad, okay? So it's kind of normal that they would react. And this is the regression counterpart of that. You can see that if you get early feedback, so that coefficient on the second line is the grade adjustment for the non-immigrant students, so for the natives. But if you are an immigrant, the interaction term is positive. So treated schools saw systematically higher grades, both by math and literature teachers in both cases. So we want to try and figure out if this was just because you know, they felt they were being watched or observed by us, or because they found something about their own stereotypes. So first of all, we exploit information on explicit bias. So this would be a question where we ask people if they think that natives and Italian students have the same right to jobs or not. And 20% of the teachers, not students, sorry, people, 20% of our teachers actually say that Italians should have preferential treatment in the labor market. So if these are people who are openly biased, we are not telling them anything new when we send an email saying you have negative stereotypes, okay? And in fact, what this table tells you is that the adjustment in grades by math and literature teacher is only found among people who have a value 1 for that WVS variable, which is the ones who say that instead they should have equal rights to jobs. The other teachers, the hardcore discriminating ones, don't respond to our communication. Second, what we do is we try to look at the precision of the information we gave you. So because teachers took 2 IATs, one with male names and the other with female names, in our email, we actually had 2 paragraphs, one that tells you, you know, for male names you came out strongly, and the other for female names you came out, you know, mildly or strongly. So what we think is that if you get strong and strong as a feedback on both cases, you're going to take it as a pretty precise signal that you are biased. While if you get one that says you're slightly and the other saying you're strongly, then you say, well, maybe this test is not measuring as much as I thought it should, okay? So here you see the impact of the revelation of stereotypes for the category of, for the group of teachers who got both high prejudice communication, so those who said strong and strong for males and females, for those who got a mixed signal, and those who got low prejudice communication back. And you see that for those who received feedback that they weren't biased, they don't adjust the grades. And those who receive feedback that they are, adjust, and they adjust more if the signal is more precise. So both of those are strong evidence. Okay? So to summarize, we found that revealing these stereotypes does reduce bias in grading, and that interventions aimed at increasing awareness of implicit stereotypes could help counteract discrimination. So I had put 2 screenshots on, companies or institutions that have started doing this type of awareness exercises. One is on Starbucks, the other is Harvard. Basically, these companies are saying that it would be good for whoever makes recruiting decision to take an IAT. As far as we know, this recommendation hasn't been tested. We don't know what happens to people once they take IATs, and we try with our paper to at least shed some light on this. So I think I did incredibly badly in thinking that I could do 3 papers instead of 2. So I'm 2 minutes short of my 1 hour. So I won't go through the slides. Let me just tell you what the third thing that I would have liked to talk about was. So this is a project that I did with Justine Burns and Lucia Corno in South Africa. And it's looking at a policy of random allocation of roommates into dorms that some of the residences at University of Cape Town employ. So we are comparing, in that case, we survey students, not teachers. We had students take implicit association tests, and we also follow these students in terms of the grades they get in their first and second year of their experience at UCT. So the first thing we want to test was the so-called contact hypothesis that political scientists have, and not only, have worked on for quite some time. So the question is, if I make you interact with a member of a group that you're not familiar with and against which you may hold negative stereotypes, does this interaction bring about a more positive view? Okay? And what we found is that indeed white South Africans who are randomly allocated a black South African roommate improve their IAT. So they become, after 1 year of living in the same room, they become less prejudiced. Okay? But then we try to go forward and say, should we care about this as economists? In particular, does this matter for the performance of the students? So first of all, we find that black students who have a white roommate do better at the end of the first and of the second year as well, even after they no longer have that roommate. And that this is not driven by the fact that their roommate is better academically, because we can control for this entry score of the roommate, but the effect is actually stronger for those blacks that had a roommate who was not prejudiced to start with. So because we have this random assignment, we get variation in whether I have a high-performing white roommate or a low-performing, or a white roommate who started off being prejudiced or started off being non-prejudiced. And we find that the academic gains for blacks are particularly strong when the white roommate started off being non-prejudiced. And talking to people on campus, there is indeed quite a sense in which there's anxiety related to intergroup interaction, and this type of exposure might have reduced intergroup anxiety. But also we collected data on their peers networks and friendship networks, and we see that there's a lot more mixing of friends for whites and black students, and that possibly this interaction with a different peer group on the academic front might have brought about these effects. So just to give you the punchline, we think that this is important because there's quite a large literature in social psychology, political science, that says, oh, we should have integration policies because this is going to decrease conflict and it's going to increase social cohesion. So the push for integration policy in that case comes from the social cohesion side. Then there's a literature in economics that says we should have integration policies because this is going to decrease inequality. It's going to level opportunities, and and what we want to say is that the two are not different things. That if you manage to decrease prejudice and improve social cohesion, this is going to help on the productive side those groups to achieve more. In our case, it helped black South Africans to do better in school. And so that looking at, again, if we were to, just get a punchline, looking at these stereotypes is not something that you only do if you want to, look nice or say that you care about reducing social conflict. Even if you just have a purely efficiency-driven agenda, reducing stereotypes seems to be a good idea. And I will close on this, and I apologize for the excessive.
That was quite a tour de force. We have about 15 minutes for questions. Why don't we open it up? Let's take a group of questions, and so that we can get as many people as possible. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for that lecture. I was a student of yours in 2007 in Bocconi, so it's great to see you again a few years later. Still a very good lecturer. I had a question coming from a family of teachers on that second paper. How much does it have to do, maybe the grade changing, especially of the control group, with the fact that teachers sometimes don't want to be bothered or harassed by parents that might come to ask about their son or daughter's performance? And given that immigrant groups are usually less aware, or even because of language, they might not feel as comfortable to approach teachers.
Patricio, you were a student too, right?
Yes.
No, he was a peer.
We shared a room for a while in an office. Yeah. So always great to listen to you, Eliana. Now, my question is related to your first paper. And you emphasize, the importance of choice, say, out of middle school into high school. And the treatment is done to the kids. My question is, who is the real decision maker? Is the kid or the father, the family? In that case, the intervention should be done on the parents rather than the kids. I mean, the results are very striking, but I was wondering whether that was the right, people to address.
Thank you. I was wondering whether you have observed any different results across teachers in schools that have a high percentage of immigrants compared to low, whether a high exposure makes any difference.
Jishnu.
Just a question on scale. So, Eliana, here in Montgomery County and in Florida, actually, for all the gifted programs, they moved from a pull model to a push model. So what they now do is they just take the scores and they send out defaults of you have been admitted, decide whether you not want to drop out or not. But what's happened is it massively pushed up the budget requirements. So even if you look at your graph, if all the top quintiles matched up with the immigrants, the overall budgetary requirements pushed up a lot. And in Florida, they had to shut down the program because they couldn't hold the budget. And in Montgomery, they actually kicked out the the other ones. They kicked out the whites and the natives from the program, which itself has created a massive backlash, right? So just in terms of, how do we think about scale and budgets? Because this has been a big conversation here, which is, should we just move to a default, you've been admitted based on your test scores, and just change the default on that?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. On the teacher bias, did you look at all at the interactions between gender and immigration? And it looks like you collected all of the data to do it, but I didn't see it quite reported.
Dion.
I guess this is probably for your first and second ones. Is there any variation in the type of immigrant? And do you see any variation in the various biases that you pick up and the effects of the program?
You said they were they had to be from countries with a lower per capita income than Italy. But with Italy's per capita income going down, you had to throw some out of the sample. Penny?
As you were talking, by the way, I live in New York, where there are many immigrants, and they are admitted to the top schools based on a test system. And I was thinking it's interesting that in the United States, often we have exactly the opposite discussion, namely that admission based on test scores may be discriminatory, and there is a push towards admitting students based on teacher recommendations and other criteria. So I guess there must be a premise in Italy that the test scores do not suffer from any biases of any form.
Okay. So that's 7 questions.
I try to do better at time management with the questions than I did with the talk. So, first of all, thank you. They're all great questions. Very quickly to my former student, very nice to see you again. So I do think there's a sense in which Italian parents are certainly more likely to show up at parent-teacher meetings and so on, which might explain the gap, just if you look at the raw gap in grades between the standardized performance, the standardized test and the teacher assigned grade. I don't think that explanation would tell you why it's systematically correlated with bias, and also why our intervention was effective. Because if I tell you you are strongly associating negative concepts with immigrant names, I'm not changing your prior that the parents will come and bug you. So it could be one of the reasons for the existence of the gap, but I think the results we have are kind of potentially orthogonal. Now, who is the decision maker for high school choice, kids or parents? But I think you're absolutely right, Patrizio, that the parent might play a role. We couldn't in this first paper have an arm where the recipient of the information was exclusively the parent, and that would have been the way to do it. But one thing we tried was to see whether, for example, we could explain the difference in results between boys and girls through the cultural background of the parents, either in terms of religion or potential, conservative or not attitudes. And in that case, we didn't manage to. So it wasn't explaining it. But I agree that I think in the future, varying the extent of the targeting of the program to students versus parents might be very important. Now, someone asked about high versus low share of immigrants and the intensity of exposure. I think that's a very good point. So in our schools, I think the sample size at the school level is not large enough that we can do very much. But one thing we did in the teachers' paper is that because we have the history of these teachers grading also with previous cohorts, not only the one on which we did the experiment, we looked at whether teacher behavior depended on how many immigrant kids they had and on the relative difference between the scores of the natives that they had in the past, not the scores that the teacher would give, the standardized test scores of the natives and the standardized test scores of the immigrants. Just to say, if you happen to have very good immigrant students in the past, are you now discriminating less in terms of the bias in grades? And that doesn't explain it, okay? So when those interactions with the IAT are the same whether you control or not for the performance of the immigrants that you yourself as a teacher have seen in the past. Now, Gisno was asking about scale and what would happen in terms of budget if this became a default to just admit on the basis of grades. So first of all, I want to, and also to Penny's, I want to make it clear that I don't think our work can speak in any way to whether the admission should be done automatically on the basis of grades, because again, we're not simply talking about one track with different quality across schools. We're actually talking about very different, even within the academic track, that's one that's more science oriented, the other is more humanities. So you need to have an element of choice. But in terms of budget, so first of all, consider that because of the aging of the Italian population and our low fertility rates, immigrant students are becoming more and more, represented in schools at the primary, middle school, and now high school level. So, you're going to be spending for students, and we provide virtually free education to everybody. So you're going to be spending nonetheless. I don't know if and how more expensive it is to go to a high track compared to a vocational, because teacher salaries are extremely low and uniform, and there's very little in terms of lab and additional costs that our pretty traditional education system has. So in my view, the budgetary implications are not at this stage particularly salient, but again, going to this, is it the case that test scores are understood to be good and unbiased in Italy? No, even the standardized test scores have been shown to be potentially manipulated by teachers, and the Invalsi applies a correction factor on that, but I don't think that's where we try to go. So the last two, where one is we've looked at the interaction of gender and immigration. We tried precisely because our feedback was on male and female names, and it's not that you only react to the type of student for which you were given negative feedback. So even if you tell me that my bias comes from association of boys and negative context, I increase the grades of all the immigrants, both boys and girls. So there's not that specificity. And the variation in the type of immigrant, so we have two types of variation that we've looked into, the first and second generation that I mentioned, and the other is by ethnic background. So the vast majority would be people from Albania, Romania, then we have people from China, as well as South America, Africa. So what we found, interestingly, when we look at the revealing experiment, is that the grade upward adjustment is not across the board. Okay, so teachers adjust grades, but they adjust them more for Eastern European and Latin American immigrant students, while if you look at Africans or Asians, the adjustment is much smaller. So, and this is, I'm not sure exactly how and why. It might be some kind of cultural proximity that makes it a little easier for these biased teachers to overcome their bias, or it might be something else. Clearly, it's just suggestive. We haven't done anything experimental to tease out these different biases within the immigrant category, but in the future, it might be interesting to look at that too.
Okay. Well, please join me in thanking Eliana for a very interesting presentation. That was very nice. You had a lot of material.
I the timing, and I must have gone.